organization. So this is the data discovery portal for our public research data repository. And one thing that we automatically generate web landing pages for data sets that are uploaded into the system, capturing the metadata and presenting it in a web friendly way. We also allow data publishers, data scientists, or research scientists at NIST to modify this information to provide extra value. They might want to provide plots, visualizations, additional metadata. This system allows them to enhance the quality of their public-facing data products. The traditional block diagram to show how it's all put together. The physical storage for our public repository is actually hosted in Amazon Web Services, and it's built in a very component-oriented way so that these systems play together and can be upgraded and improved on an incremental basis as storage capacity increases or other improvements are made. We also use a tool called Socrata, which is a commercial product for publishing tabular data. Socrata has the advantage that you can dynamically filter, sort, plot any data in a table. It also automatically generates application programming interfaces so that rather than always accessing or querying data through a web form, which can get tedious after your 100th query, you can actually script that up and use the API to access data. We also host a data collection for the Materials Genome Initiative, which is a funny name. It's not about genomics. It's about making new materials faster, more efficiently, and basically the merger of simulation and experimentation. So we host a data repository for the Materials Genome Initiative at NIST called materialsdata.nist.gov. It's based on the DSpace infrastructure. And so it has this idea of communities, research communities. They can decide at what point they want to share their data. They can have a private collection for working data. They can share data when it's ready for public consumption. We're also investigating the deployment of laboratory information management systems, LIMS. This hasn't come up very much here, but basically the idea is that a LIMS system allows you to capture metadata at the time data is taken. As I mentioned before, a lot of the data we take comes out of instruments in proprietary formats. So part of a LIMS system is a metadata extractor that allows you to move that data out of that proprietary format into a database system that then is generally accessible. And this is really important because, as we discussed yesterday, trying to do metadata annotation afterwards is expensive, tedious. Scientists don't do it, they won't do it, so you have to get this done on an automatic basis. And this is, we're doing a pilot right now with some of our electron microscopes, which we hope will set the stage for wider deployment of LIMS systems across NIST. Last thing I just want to mention is about reproducibility. Victoria gave a great talk yesterday about this. Since we are the U.S. National Metrology Institute, we think it's really incumbent upon NIST to help address the so-called reproducibility crisis. And we are about measurement and uncertainty quantification and design of experiments. So I, with some of my colleagues at NIST, have recently written up a paper about guidelines for what makes for reproducible research. It's not just that you can get exactly the numbers I get. In fact, a lot of what NIST does with other metrology institutes is do comparison measurements, and often they don't agree. And sometimes they don't agree beyond the uncertainty calculations. That tells you something, assuming you've done your work well, about the nature of the measurement and about physics. So getting a different answer is not necessarily a bad thing. It could actually lead to fundamentally new results. So challenges at NIST are we have an incredible diversity of research programs. NIST does just about everything under the sun, from engineering through to basic science and timekeeping, biology, chemistry, materials, you name it, we do it, except not much astronomy. We have a very conservative culture because people who do this kind of measurement science are, shall we say, somewhere on the spectrum. Don't quote me on that. There is generally little recognition for data sharing and publication in terms of professional advancement. That's not just a NIST issue, that is really science-wide. Proprietary data formats I talked about. And then NIST is not a standards-setting organization, it's not regulatory, but we do have these recommendations that were mentioned many times yesterday about IT security. That means that we have to eat our own dog food, and we have to scrutinize every piece of software, everything we develop in-house that is going to have any sort of public face for IT security considerations, and that takes a lot of time. But the outlook is that we are working to establish a sound infrastructure for data discovery, access, and interoperability, and we have more to do, building up our informatics and analytics capabilities, like machine learning and data mining, expanding scope from our pilots to full-up operations, strengthening our standard reference data program, making it easy to share data products, and strengthening our role in the international metrology arena. So I'm really excited about what we're doing at NIST. I've been there just over 3 years now, and I think we really have if not an evolution, almost a revolution in the way that we are managing data at NIST, which I hope to see through before I retire. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Jeff is now going to represent some insights into what NOAA is doing around this data management issue.
All right, thank you very much, and congratulations on your successful, reasonable pronunciation. Yep.
As long as you don't say your last name, we'll be fine, right?
Oh, it's just about to. Well, all right. No, but it's actually de la Beaujardière, and if that's hard, I know why it's difficult. It's because there's a slight typo in the name tag. It's missing the accent grave on one of the letters. So if you just, let that be your guide, you'll be great. All right. Yes. All right, so everybody actually calls me Jeff DLB because it's a lot easier. I'm going to tell you about NOAA's data management perspective and plans. I've been at NOAA in this job for about 5 years or something like that. I was with the Integrated Ocean Observing System at NOAA, before that in 2008, and before that at NASA. So I've been working actually on public access to data for like 20, 25 years. It's kind of depressing to think that it's not all publicly accessible yet, but so it goes. Before that, I was in solar physics, and fortunately before the requirement for data management plans and everything, so my data are on an exabyte tape in a box in my office. So if you want it, call me, and I'll get it. Yeah. All right, so next slide, which of these is that button? Yes, okay. So NOAA has big data in the sense of the volume of data, the variety of data, the velocity of how fast it comes in. We've got satellites, radars, ships that measure bathymetry under the sea, buoys, tide gauges, all these things. But more and more autonomous vehicles like gliders, undersea gliders. Some data are not collected by observing systems or sensors, but by humans with clipboards or counting how many fish were caught by fisheries vessels and making sure we're not overfishing, or they're scuba diving and looking at coral reefs and things like that. A ton of numerical models, like the ones that were forecasting the path of the recent hurricanes and today's weather and so forth, and some extramurally funded data. So we do, I think most of our funding goes for internal data production, but some goes for extramural data. And in any case, the data tend to be unique, valuable, costs a lot to collect, irreplaceable, you can't go back and remeasure, and of course collected at taxpayer expense, so we would like them to be publicly accessible. So the vision, and my vision as chair of our data management committee, is that all of our data should be discoverable by the public, accessible, online, usable, which means well-documented, well-formatted, preserved in an archive for anybody, unless there's a good reason why we can't do that. There's some limited cases where the data are, privately or are restricted, but almost all of our data are or should be publicly accessible. So how are we doing this? Well, we have a bunch of policies which my committee issues, and in fact, we just sort of finished issuing or revising, writing all of the policies that we told the White House we would write in response to the 2013 memo on public access to research results. So it's kind of the list of them there. The one in the bottom right is the data sharing directive for NOAA grantees. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute, and that's really the only one that applies to the extramural data. All the other ones apply in-house, and so we are imposing requirements on ourselves which are actually stricter than what we impose on grantees. So there's a kind of a general one that talks about data should be accessible. We have kind of a framework document, which is kind of like a manifesto of why you should do this and what the organization and the kind of enterprise architecture of it is at NOAA. We have directives that say you have to have a data management plan, your data must be accessible, this is how to cite data if you want, this is how you get a DOI, your data must have documentation or metadata, and there's a procedure for getting your data into the archive. So we've written all these. You can see dates, 2011 and so forth. They've been around for a while. In fact, our data sharing directive predates the White House memo, but we revised it and improved it as a result of that. And we are just now concluding an assessment of who actually wrote a data management plan, not the grantees, but which observing systems at NOAA actually got their data management plan written. And it's not 100%, but it's more than 50%, so that's good. And we're trying to put a little bit of pressure on people by revealing these numbers in a couple of weeks to sort of senior leadership, so we get a little more pressure on. So anyway, we're working on all that. And by the way, the point for us is not that you have a plan. The point is that you think about how you make your data accessible, documented, archived. And that's what we're really, really going for. Okay, besides policies, we are doing some implementation activities. We have this thing called the Unified Access Framework with a little funding. They've been sort of knitting together a bunch of servers at NOAA, focusing mostly on gridded data and lately some in situ data, using something called the Threads data server. Some of you may be familiar with it. We have the Big Earth Data Initiative, which for the last 3 years has let us give small grants to groups at NOAA to make their data more accessible, discoverable, documented. We have a metadata metrics tool, which sort of looks at metadata and sees how complete it is and gives scores and sees whether we're getting better over time. There's some work on tools to write metadata. We're taking advantage of the new ISO metadata standard. We use the ISO standard for geographic metadata, and a new version has come out, and we'd like to sort of migrate to that within a couple of years and at the same time have tools that make it easier. I personally don't think you should have to edit XML to write metadata, but that you should be able to sort of answer some questions like you do in TurboTax when you write your taxes or something like that. Just tell me about your data, and then we get it for you. Or software to automate the creation in a lot of cases. And then there's other projects throughout NOAA for data access and so forth. We have a catalog that was established as a result of the OMB open data policy. You can get to it at data.noaa.gov. It's actually has been having a few issues and is in the process of being migrated to some other hardware, so I'm not even going to try to do a demo of it, but there's been about 70,000 plus or minus data sets in there. The number's growing. In fact, one day there was a harvest failure, so 10,000 data sets went away, and people thought, oh, the administration is telling us to delete data. It's not true. It was just, temporary failure. So we've got this catalog there, and it connects up to data.gov, and we're trying to make it so that if you've done the right thing, if you have data and you write a metadata record and you put it in a web accessible folder that the catalog knows about, then you're done. Because the catalog will read it, and then data.gov will read it, and the International Group on Earth Observations will read it, and you don't have to go register your stuff manually in a bunch of other places. And when I say you, I'm actually talking about NOAA intramural people. We don't currently have a good extramural connection into this catalog, but we're kind of working on that. Okay, we have a data set ID project. We've started assigning DOIs a couple of years ago, and as most of you know, you get a DOI, it points to a landing page, which in our case we generate directly from the metadata, and that has links to the full metadata record and to the data which is stored in our archive. And a fundamental requirement is you cannot get a NOAA DOI unless your data are in one of our NOAA archives. So that's been promoting, in fact, data archiving. We currently have been assigning these kind of manually, so the number's going up, but it's sort of on a one at a time basis. But we have a couple of thousand DOIs for data sets and, well, not quite a couple thousand, but 1,500 for data sets, as well as some technical reports. And we're starting to see citations. This is kind of rough number of citations in Google Scholar. So it's kind of going up. The last column is a year to date. So don't quite know what the 2017 total is, but people are citing our DOI prefix. So there's some benefits. You get a permanent citable ID, it's based on an international standard, there's recognition by publishers, and you get credit from your boss during your annual performance review. No, not yet. But that's one thing we're trying to. In fact, we've written that down in our data management framework. We said, hey, people should be getting credit for having curated a good data set and made it available, just as if they'd written a paper or something like that. So we'd like that to happen, and that's something we mention now and then to leadership. Okay. So we do have challenges managing our internal data. Even though in theory we're all one agency and we should be able to mandate everything, we're still multiple line offices that do different things that were brought together historically, as the government kind of evolved. So we're not all there yet. The good news is there are a ton of people who are very dedicated, they're very smart, and they're working on making the data accessible and of good quality and sending it to the archive. So I want to praise a lot of the people who work at NOAA on these things. I don't get to control their budgets and I'm not their boss, and yet we're getting really good work together, 100 people or something, kind of all moving in a similar direction. So that's really good. But it still takes a lot of work. We don't have an enterprise-wide approach. There's not a single system, a single standard to do all this. People don't often have the resources or the tools or the training to do what they want. We have legacy things. Somebody built an observing system 20 years ago. It's still running. It has a proprietary data format. They never had a data management plan. So bringing kind of historical stuff in, or data that's not even digital, right? Paper, microfiche, mag tape, whatever. So there's still a lot to do. And too often, your data management is a side job in addition to your regular duties, and you're not necessarily getting credit for that. So we'd love to see that evolve. Okay, so for grantees now, just a little cartoon kind of step-by-step of what you would do if you're submitting a proposal to NOAA. So there's NOAA, and then there's researchers, that's you folks. We're going to issue a federal funding opportunity, and we're going to include in that some data management guidance. And when you write your proposal, we'd like you to include a data management plan that is sort of reflective of that guidance. Or if you're smarter than us and you have a better idea, tell us and kind of explain why you're proposing to do what you're going to do. And if you're lucky, after review, and the review will include the data management plan, just like with NSF, then you'll get some funding, and you'll go and create some data, collect some data, you'll write some papers. That's great, just as it always was, but what we're asking you to do, of course, is make your data accessible somehow, and to cite your data with a digital object identifier if you write a paper about it, and to cite the funding with FundRef, which is this sort of interoperable method of reporting funding, and then to submit your accepted manuscript into our institutional repository of documents. And we'll keep it hidden there for a year, and then after 1 year we'll make it available. But during and after that year, we will link to the version of record at the journal with its DOI, but just have this kind of, oh, by the way, manuscript copy in case people in 1 year want to get a copy of the article without a subscription to the journal. So that's kind of the landscape of what we're doing. This is starting to happen. A few federal funding opportunities have come out, and we're starting to track, and there's been some augmentations through the tracking software to kind of make sure that things are happening. But there are still some challenges. So we're asking researchers, make your data accessible, but how do we monitor this? We're giving you 2 years after the end of the grant. Actually, technically, it's 2 years or at time of publication of a paper based on the data, whichever is sooner. So how do we actually monitor this? This is a little bit hard. And then hosting. We can't necessarily take all of the grantee data in our archive. It could be a question of volume, could be a type we've never seen before. We may not be willing to steward it for decades because that's what we agree to do when we take it into our archive. So where should you put your data? We need some approved repositories, probably domain-specific ones that are good for the community. And do you put your data in there permanently, a century, or is it just 5 years? That's never really been answered. And then just another issue which I feel was not really addressed in this whole push to make data accessible is we'd like data to be reusable, right? The whole point of making it accessible is that people can get to it and maybe do new things with data from multiple sources. But so if we've got data just kind of scattered across multiple sites and in different formats and so forth, can we really do new science? Are we just kind of augmenting the problem of disparate data stored all over the place? It would be nice to have a little more cohesiveness in how we do that. So those are some challenges. Okay, that's a blank slide to signal that I'm moving from sort of fact to opinion, so a lot of the rest of this is my opinion. Not NOAA policy necessarily, but one, I want to stress data management is not the goal, right? We don't want to just manage data, we want to use and reuse data, and we want to extract maximum value from it. So NOAA is part of the Department of Commerce, just like NIST. We'd like to promote commerce in the US and elsewhere and let people actually do stuff with our data, just like there's a whole weather industry from our weather data. Another thing is users want answers often. They don't want a huge data set, or they don't want hundreds of tiny little data sets, right? They want to know, where do I plant my crop? Do I have to evacuate? Where should I build a wind farm? Where am I going to find powder for skiing next weekend? That's my personal question. And so we want to support non-expert data users, and we want to distill these huge data sets sometimes to one bit, right? Yes or no, do I bring my umbrella? That's all I want to know. I don't want terabytes of model output. I want to know, do I bring my umbrella, right? So this is good. So we've got challenges of data volume and data complexity represented here by the plasma fluid equations, reminding me why I don't do plasma physics anymore. So traditionally, and I know I've got 1 minute left and 9 seconds, my timer's going too, we've got data from various sources. There's users who want to use data in their tools, and we've been working on a kind of standardized data services layer. Let's give you, data access services, data discovery, so forth, based on standards, and that's great. But what really happens is every one of those sources has to have their own data access service. And we've got a data discovery portal, a catalog floating around out there, and then all the users are making copies of the data at their own premises, and this is getting harder and harder to do because the data are getting bigger. It's a security risk because we are running these services all over the place. It's a maintenance burden because we have to run the services and so forth. So one thing we're thinking about more is sending stuff to the cloud. So imagine a master copy of NOAA data is getting sent outside of our security boundary into commercial cloud, Amazon, Google, IBM, whatever, with some tools there that will work on the data and help you chain together things to make decisions. And we bring users into the cloud, so they're computing directly on the data in the cloud and not bringing it to their own location, and the only thing they're sucking back out of there is whatever derived information products, and there's my timer saying I've just run out of time. I do want to stress that we have to keep on-premises computing. I'm not saying everything goes to the cloud, but some things we would like to send to the cloud. My wish is that we fully leverage the cloud, so we currently send data operationally to dedicated customers into the archive, but let's also send a copy to the cloud wherever possible. I know there are issues, there's egress costs, there's possibly unbounded costs, we might have to re-architect for being more efficient, and then there's IT security policy, which makes it hard for us to do that because they haven't caught up yet with the modern era, but they will someday, I hope. We have an R&D project in this area with 5 partners, and we're sending selected data set to there. This is the subject of a whole other talk, so I'm going to take another 15 minutes and all. Okay. So my second and sort of final wish is better tools for decision making. We've got complicated data from multiple sources. We've got non-expert users on the other side. What's between them to help them make their decisions? I would like to see a bunch of composable functions that you could string together in a workflow for derived information products and integrating data from multiple sources. All of that, when appropriate, running in the cloud and understanding where the data are stored there. So I understand we're taking questions later, so I'll sit back down and sorry for going over by...
No, you're fine. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. DLB. That was great. All the talks have been really informative, and I appreciate them. So next we have Lisa Federer from the National Institutes of Health.
Thank you. Okay, do we have slides? Maybe? All right, excellent. Okay, so let me just see here how this will go. Okay, good. All right, so thank you. So I wanted to give a little bit of background first on the NIH and also who I am and why I'm up here. So the National Institutes, plural, of Health includes 27 institutes and centers. And like NSF, we send most of our funding out the door. About 80% of our funding funds extramural research, and about 20% funds intramural research at the NIH campus in Bethesda, a little bit north of here, as well as some other facilities, Baltimore, there's one in Montana, North Carolina. So we have a lot of intramural research as well as extramural research, and the intramural research is what I support. So I work in the NIH library, which is often confused with the National Library of Medicine, but we are the smaller library on campus, and we serve the intramural researchers. So many of the policies and the things I'm going to talk about apply to extramurally funded people, all of you from your various institutions, but we are also eating our own dog food, so all of our intramural researchers have to comply with these various policies and best practices as well. And so that is my job, to assist people with that. An informationist, in case you've never heard of that title, most people haven't, is sort of a cross between a librarian and a scientist or practitioner. So I have training in library and information science as well as data science, and informationists often don't spend their time in a library, they spend their time out in a lab or in a clinical setting, which is what I often do as well. So I'm sort of a practitioner, but I also am involved with some of policy making at the NIH. I sit on several committees around policy making, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So, with that background in mind, I do want to start, like I said, with a little bit of policy related to both data sharing and data management. This is something that is very much a moving target for, I think, many funders, but especially for the NIH for reasons I'll talk about. One of those is the 21st Century Cures Act. So, the OSTP memo has been brought up several times by my colleagues. The NIH, at the time of that memo, already had in place policies that addressed part of that, which was the access to the articles. We have PubMed Central, where people had been depositing articles that came out of NIH-funded research since 2008. But the second part, the data sharing part, was not something that we currently had a funder-wide policy for. And we did do some work around developing policy, but it couldn't really be implemented until the passage of this 21st Century Cures Act in November of last year for certain legislative reasons. But this act included this language that spoke to data sharing and allowed us to then move forward with this policy. So while we do not at this present moment have a policy in place, policies are in the works. I think I can say that a policy will be coming out soon for public comment, so that's something that you can look for in the next few months, and NIH will require not a DMP, but a DMSP, just to throw another acronym out there for you, a data management and sharing plan that requires that you address not only how you're going to manage that data, but how you will share it in the future. So I did want to highlight a few existing policies. As I mentioned, we do have 27 institutes and centers, and although we are funding, biomedical and life sciences, specifically, we have a lot of different science within those 27 institutes. Some fund very specific, like disease areas, like the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Some fund body systems, like the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Some fund sort of broad areas of research, like the National Institute of Nursing Research. And within all of those, we also have a broad range of types of science, from basic science, in vitro experiments, animal experiments and these sorts of things, through to clinical trials. We actually have a sort of a hospital at the NIH campus in Bethesda where patients come and participate in clinical trials. So we have a broad range of data with a wide variety of concerns around sharing that data and different places where you might share that data. So if I'm a researcher doing computational biology research, I have very different data types and data sharing needs than, say, someone who's working with highly sensitive patient data, especially at the main clinical center at NIH where we do that patient research. A lot of those are patients with very rare diseases, people that only 10 to 12 people in the world have that disease. So obviously it's going to be very easy to identify those people if we try to share that data. So there's a lot of ranges of concerns around this. So to have one sort of one-size-fits-all data sharing policy and management policy wouldn't really work for the type of science that we are doing and funding. And so therefore, there are several different policies that speak to some of the different areas of science, and I want to point out a couple here. First is the policy on dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information. This is one of the newer policies that came out and again speaks specifically to clinical trials. We also work closely with clinicaltrials.gov where people would register trials and share trial information there. The genomic data sharing policy is also a newer policy that applies to both human and non-human genomic data. So any type of data that's collected that has anything to do with genomic information, human or not, applies to this policy, and that is expected to be shared. This policy is a little bit different from some of the other policies that we have in that it's very prescriptive of where the data will be shared. There are several NIH-funded and other databases that specifically house things like human genome data or mouse genome data or whatever it might be. So this particular policy is very specific about what needs to be shared, where it needs to be shared, and when it needs to be shared. So there are some other policies there that I'm not going to speak in depth about because, as I said, these are sort of moving targets, and what I say today may not actually be true next month or even next week. But I will say that in general, the overall policy that pertains to data sharing at the NIH now and since 2003 is that data sharing is only required for grants that consist of $500,000 in direct annual funding or more. So that's a fairly small portion of the grants that we fund, but again, that policy is coming that will require the broader data sharing and management plans from all NIH grantees as well as NIH intramural researchers. So I want to move away from policy and talk a little bit more about some of the other efforts that I say here to support data reuse, but it's really sort of data management, data sharing, data reuse, and all these sort of areas within the sort of spectrum of the data lifecycle. There are many, many, many things going on at the NIH, some of these specific to certain types of science, some of them more broad. So I'm going to highlight a few here, but this is certainly not all that's going on at the NIH. I think these are just some efforts that are sort of broadly applicable, I hope, to the audience here. So one of the efforts that has been ongoing for about the last 3 years is the development of a product called DataMed. So if you are familiar with the biomedical literature at all, you've probably used PubMed, which is housed at the NIH, at the National Library of Medicine. If I were a researcher or a clinician and I wanted to find an article, say, about the latest treatment for breast cancer, it would be really difficult to find that article if I had to know exactly what journal it was in. PubMed sort of solves that problem. I can go and I can search across multiple journals. I don't have to have a specific idea of where it is. DataMed is sort of intended to solve the same problem for data. Right now we have many, many thousands of repositories that house different types of data. So if you want to know, if you want to find some data, you typically have to know where, in what repository, or at least what type of repository you might find it. The idea behind DataMed is to have a sort of federated search across multiple repositories that would enable you to locate data without specifically knowing in advance where you might find it. This is especially beneficial in the realm of biomedical science because, as I said, we do have the various spectrums of science that we fund, from the basic science through to the clinical science, and although those communities are very separate, they don't talk to each other typically, a lot of the data within those different communities would be relevant to each other. So you may not necessarily know the repository that might have the information that you would want, and so having something like this is helpful. Having something like this, however, is not trivial. In something like PubMed, all of the articles, no matter what field they're talking about, have pretty similar metadata. They have, bibliographic metadata that's pretty easy to bring together, but different data sets from different data repositories often have very different types of metadata and use very different language. So getting all of this into one sort of searchable system is a big challenge. So that is the idea behind DataMed. Rather than develop this internally at the NIH, the approach that has been taken has been to fund this as an extramural activity. This was funded through the NIH Big Data to Knowledge Initiative, which is a NIH-wide initiative to develop certain activities around data science. So DataMed was built at the University of California, San Diego through their BioCaddy grant. And it is currently available for, this is not an up-to-date slide, it has more repositories now, but you can see that they've started to incorporate some of these repositories and to make this available for people to use. So another effort that I want to mention is common data elements. So if we're going to be collecting data, particularly about human subjects, that's a very time-intensive and labor-intensive, undertaking. It involves bringing people in, taking patients' time. So it would be nice if we would be able to reuse some of that data, particularly when we have researchers who are working in similar areas, and especially when we're working with rare diseases where we, don't have very many patients, and we want to make sure that we're going to make those data sets interoperable. And that's sort of the idea behind common data elements. So these CDE collections are basically sets of sort of metadata or data dictionaries that you can adopt for your study. So if I was going to, for example, do a study on autism, and I wanted to make sure that my data set was going to be interoperable with those that are in the National Database on Autism Research, which is one of the NIH databases, I could use one of these common data element collections to ensure that the data I collect are going to be interoperable with those data sets. So these CDE collections, you can see here, are sort of organized in subject areas, so you can find one that's relevant to your area of research. These are also undergoing ongoing development, so if there's not one in your particular area of research, there are opportunities to develop these. And so they allow you to work a little bit more efficiently and ensure that your data are going to be workable with the community. The other nice thing about the CDEs is that there are these CDE toolboxes that you can use so that you can actually basically collect your data more easily. So rather than having to start completely from scratch, you can get one of these CDE toolboxes that essentially has everything organized for you, so you know exactly what to collect. And then I just wanted to also highlight again the importance of reproducibility and reuse that we've heard over and over again in the last couple days. This is especially important to the NIH. Obviously, it's very important for science in general to be reproducible, but I think if we're talking about medications for humans, we want to make sure that the information is actually correct and true. So it's a special concern for the NIH, and this is an area that there are several different guidelines around, both in terms of reproducibility and rigor in general, but the NIH has also recognized the important role that data management and sharing plays in reproducibility and reuse, so many of the policies that we have sort of speak to this. So I will end there, and thank you.
A great panel, really amazing insights and perspectives, and we really appreciate what you've brought to us today, and we hope actually by the next 20 or so minutes you'll get something back from us as well, and that our questions are in fact informative to you and helpful as well. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, and again, what I'd ask that all of you do, because we are recording this, is that you speak to a microphone so that we can be sure that everyone hears. So while people are gathering with microphones, I have one question maybe to begin things, and we can then sort of queue up behind the microphones. We've seen in a lot of the solicitations an emphasis toward partnering with commercial entities. I wonder if within sort of the data management areas where there's, again, a great emphasis towards openness, if you've had internal discussions about how to sort of deal with the potential polemic between sort of the intellectual property components to private data and the openness that the agencies tend to promote.
No.
No. So from NOAA's standpoint, it hasn't been a problem.
Not in our case.
Of course, a lot of, as I mentioned about like our standard reference data, we have a lot of relationships with the private sector. We see a lot of our data products embedded into commercial products. That's really kind of fulfilling our commerce-related mission for improving the competitiveness and dominance, if you will, of U.S. industry. So we are very much partners with the private sector at NIST.
So I would just say, as you probably know, in the biomedical space, a lot of research is done by pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of money to be made from these sorts of things, and so the NIH is very aware that there are sensitive issues around data sharing. That if there is sort of an industry area that's involved, there are not necessarily requirements to make everything immediately open, yeah.
This was intended for a taller person. Just saying. So to echo what's been said by Robert and by Lisa, is to remind you that most of our missions include connection with commerce. It's right there in the NSF mission. We are there ultimately. Yes, we're a basic research funding agency, and yes, we believe in the importance of protecting and cultivating human curiosity, preferably in the areas of science, technology, and engineering. But ultimately, we also expect these things eventually to be translated into products that promote the welfare of the nation. And we have a catalog of success stories. In computer science, we always like to point to Google, which got a grant from us at a critical time, and look at the taxes they're paying, so so this is a good thing. And Qualcomm is another one for those of you in networking. We don't love data more than we love networking. And in our supercomputers, our high-performance computers, CASC, these are not built and operated by NSF. They are operated under cooperative agreements to us, and these are provisioned, in fact. The hardware, the stuff, is Intel, IBM, and all our friends in industry. So the relationship with industry is intertwined with the ability to build the infrastructure and actually conduct the research. So it's not as clean, sadly, or from some people's perspective, as we want it all to be open. That is not the policy of the United States. It's not the policy of the NSF. And frankly, it doesn't leverage the very good work that does take place at IBM, AT&T, and so on down the line. So that's one answer to that question. The second, and more specific to the world in which we're currently inhabiting, concerns not data, but Amy Walton can correct me. I think we see this issue more in the software space than we do in the data space, to the extent that we can draw a distinction. Fortunately, most scientific software really doesn't have immediate commercial value. So in our solicitations, we do require licenses and various safeguards against protecting the public investment from what might become a future highly valuable commercial investment. But from our point of view, we work hard to achieve the correct balance between the different interests, recognizing that in the long run, all those interests are important to the welfare of the nation.
Thank you very much. Before you ask your question, if you could just also remember to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dave Fearon from Johns Hopkins. My service is part of the university libraries. We work with both all of our campuses, including medical campus. But we got our start, like many library groups here, from the NSF policy that allowed us to start with a data management plan support, and then also start an archive support as well. So we benefited from that initial kick in the pants to get that going, and I think we're all aware of how the incentive to really work on good data management plans dwindled down, and we just finished a survey of data management plans from recent proposals, and we're seeing, the clear difference between the people we've helped doing a pretty good job, mostly recycling their old plans, and then the people we haven't helped is kind of still Wild West. So my question is, a couple questions. What do you see as the next kick in the pants that might be coming or should come as data sharing policies maybe are being looked at again, if they are? And also, will there be better guidance for reviewers who are the faculty peers? That's something we've tried to put out, but haven't really seen much guidance from NSF on helping the peer reviewers really look at data management plans. And perhaps Lisa could follow up briefly on how do NIH-funded researchers, how are they going to deal with their kick in the pants coming up? Because we're, of course, very worried about that, with our 3 consultants who have to help with that campus as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So I can definitely feel for you. Before being in my position at NIH, I was at the UCLA Library around the time that the DMP requirement came out, so I totally have been in your shoes. And I can say that, having been involved with the development of the NIH policy, there is a lot of guidance around it. So I think that, it's not going to be something that should come as a surprise or something that people, I hope, will feel unclear about. We are working on developing guidance that will ensure that people know exactly what they're expected to include and where they should be putting their data and these sorts of things. I also hope that since this is something that has been around for a while, even though people in the biomedical community may not have had this requirement, they might be able to look to some of their colleagues in other fields and some existing DMPs and other related support that could help guide them. And then to your question about reviewers, I think that's also really important. Since the reviewers for many of these grants are coming from the same, community that hasn't really had this requirement before, how do we know what is a good DMP? This is, something that will be evaluated. So yes, that guidance to reviewers is also very important and something that the NIH is thinking about.
I'd like to first amplify my glib response to your question. Yes, about the private sector. Right. Yes, we work with the private sector. No, we have not had issues with data sharing and the private sector yet. In terms of what might come down the pike, I think there's a Open Data Act, I think I forget the exact name of it, but it's sort of the law version of the open data policy that was in 2013. So if that gets passed, and it has been sort of a draft for a couple of congressional sessions, that could be another impetus or acceleration. It's, I think, mostly the same, but it has some extra stuff in it. In terms of guidance for reviewers, we've been doing that on a kind of per program basis because it really depends on the nature of the data you're funding. No complaints yet, no reviewers saying, please give us better guidance, but we certainly would update that if appropriate.
So I think our experience has been roughly equivalent to Jeff's. In fact, I would be very interested in seeing the study. Of course, we all like to see data. We actually are seeing, to the extent I'm allowed to talk about it because proposal review is confidential, we are seeing an improvement in the data management plans that are coming through. A clear improvement. And we're also seeing more attention paid to it by the reviewers without us pushing them. In terms of formal guidance, one of the eye candy slides that I flashed up included what the different directorates are doing. And at least one of them, I know, the Director for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, has posted guidance directed not only towards proposers, but also towards panelists. Again, remember, we can't talk much about what we say to panelists because the review process is confidential. So you can only take my word for it, and Amy Walton, who runs panels more than I do, thankfully for me, and I hope she enjoys it. I certainly enjoy visiting her panels. They're always well run. I believe you cover data management plans and your expectation. She runs the data program. So this, again, to sing the standard song, is highly variable across NSF. It depends on, as was said, what is your research problem, what is the data, and what are the expectations about surrounding the data, not only from us, but from the scholarly societies and the culture itself. So I would throw it back, if not on the libraries, I would throw it back on CASC and the professional societies to say what is expected in your space, because we will reify that, and we will turn and say what is expected if you're in chemistry, what is expected if you're in the life science, where are you, as a way to address exactly the important question that you had raised.
Thank you.
And I would just add, I would rather talk about carrots than sticks. I would like to see value added as a result of good data management planning. Certainly at NIST, it helps us to anticipate data storage needs, computation needs. It helps us to facilitate collaborations for people who are using the same or similar instrumentation, the same or similar software. So we see it as a long-term advantage in terms of better planning and better data practice.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Leslie McIntosh, and I'm with Research Data Alliance, but I'm also asking this question as the director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics and having facilitated data and information within a clinical site, so we had to deal with the privacy issue. And just a comment and then a question, one of the things that we noticed is we separated sharing into transparency versus accessibility, so that transparency had to be absolutely clear on all elements, but accessibility to the public did not, even though privately within our center it absolutely had to be. Now that was the own standard that I put on ourselves. That being said, one of the things that I found challenging was the support to facilitate this type of process for researchers, right? So I'm not part of the library, but informaticians and librarians tend to work together. So what type of support are you potentially looking to facilitate this, to make this easier for the researchers to make their work reproducible without putting more of the burden on them and yet facilitating the science and your goals?
Thank you.
Well, that's why I mentioned LIMS systems that we're trying to deploy throughout NIST eventually, so that the metadata capture and curation is done on the front end with little or no extra effort from the researchers. I think that's just generally a key to this problem. If you make the researchers jump through extra hoops, they're not going to do it, and we'll be stuck where we are today. So you have to automate this as much as you can. And then we also, in my group, work closely with the research library staff at NIST, who often do a lot of hand-holding with our staff in terms of helping them prepare their data for publication. They assign the DOIs for the public data. And so we have a very fruitful collaboration with the library.
So I would just say in terms of the technological aspects, that's definitely a challenge, and part of what the NIH has thought about is, funding things like how do we do adequate patient de-identification. That's not a trivial task. But in terms of the policy as well, I think, again, there's not the expectation that everything can or should be completely openly shared, and there are already some examples of, and probably you're familiar with some of these, databases that provide access to data within a more controlled setting. So for example, like the dbGaP, the database of genotypes and phenotypes, you can see like a description of the data and apply for it, but you have to sort of demonstrate that you have a legitimate research reason for accessing that very sensitive patient data. So I think that serves as a good model for this type of question in terms of how to facilitate access to the data, but to the appropriate people.
Yeah, at NOAA, I'd like to see an evolution where we know in advance that we could take all of the extramurally funded data and archive it on your behalf, possibly privately for a while and then exposing it publicly after another time, but just not quite there yet.
Fantastic.
So, I have the mic.
You have the mic.
May I?
Yes,
Thank
you may. Yes,
So-
please.
Thank you. I'm Barry Schneider from NIST and formerly program director at NSF. One thing my colleague, Bob Haney, didn't mention was that data goes beyond just instruments and what comes from computation. In fact, in one area that I'm involved with, it's mathematics. Some of you might know, who are certainly people in the physical and engineering sciences, know that there was a publication in 1964, which was the NBS Handbook of Mathematical Functions. It was the most cited publication in the history, and may still be the most cited publication in the history of NBS and NIST. In 2000, it was decided to bring that into the modern world. And in 2011, NIST put out the Digital Library of Mathematical Functions, which you can go look up at dlmf.nist.gov. The point I'm trying to make here is that even in mathematics, NIST had to put out something which was verifiable and set standards. And it took 11 years from the concept. And by the way, the funding came actually from both NIST and NSF to do this. It took 11 years before this actually came out, which is a testimony to how hard it is to do these kinds of things. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much for that perspective.
Sorry for not saying that, Barry.
I think we have another question on that.
I'm Jaime Convaliza from Johns Hopkins. So, Amy, thank you for describing all the steps of the data management and the process, in particular the review. That's helpful. I think that I missed, maybe it was at the end of your slides when you were too fast. Is there an element of compliance for the PIs? That is this part of the final report? And for Robert, could you comment on the different frameworks that you describe? Are these open source or is the code available? Thank you.
So I think I had a slide that was coming in at 1 minute 99, you know. Yes, there's a slide on that in the deck that specifically addresses compliance. And yes, data management plans should be reported on in your annual and final reports. They will be addressed during site visits, and they will be covered in an A133 review. They are elements of the contract between NSF and the university.
And yes, all the software we're developing around data sharing, the resource registries, our public data repository is all public code, it's all in GitHub and available for reuse freely.
Thank you. I think we have a question over here, and then Ben, we'll get the microphone to you maybe next after that. Yes?
Me?
Yes.
This is Avani Patra, been around. At NSF for some time, DOE for some time, right now at Buffalo. Question I was going to ask, it's more of a comment. There is a lot of talk about sort of a posteriori things after the data is generated, how to make it shareable. But when you generate data as a researcher, when I generate data that I'm going to give somebody else, as opposed to data that I'll use in my private thinking, there's very different standards, very different investments of effort in terms of documentation and so forth. So this quote-unquote born shared, I think folks need to understand the difference and how to support that process. How do we train the graduate students? How do we train the faculty to do that? And there has to be incentives. I don't think STICS will do that anymore. But you avoid a lot of the problems in the after-the-fact process if you propagate this movement. So I'm urging folks up the dais to start talking about born shared.
I think that's an excellent point, and yesterday I think we had some of our panelists speak to what they're doing at their institutions to address that, but I think continuing to repeat that is really critical because there are a lot of things to be gained by being better data stewards. Thank you.
And I would also just add, I think that's why NIH decided to add that S to the DMP, make it a DMSP, because, you know, in recognition that it's not just about managing data, but managing it with sharing in mind.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
It's true that there's a difference between making your data available and using it just for yourself, but there's just so much benefit in documenting it and making it kind of self-interoperable, even if it's yourself, because yourself 5 years later, when you go back and look at it, is a new person, right? So,
3 months.
Yeah, 3 months, whatever, right? So I think and when it's sensor-collected data that's just kind of coming off of
some system, yeah, getting that into the archive in, near real time is ideal, yeah.
We have a few more minutes, so I'd like to try to get at least 2 more questions
So we don't
in.
get NSF's perspective?
Yes, you do, actually. Let's hear it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Amy.
So yes, we would agree, and I think my last slide, the insomnia one, was about data in flight as opposed to data at rest. And that came from a very interesting paper put forward by the LIGO team, which talked about the observations and how you manage the observations after they come off the instrument and what you do with the simulation and so on. It's moving around among a bunch of centers and computers and all the rest of it. And then there are the data products themselves, which is what is more widely distributed. So I agree with you, and we are sensitive increasingly to the issues having to do, as you say, with born sharing or data that is, if you will, contained within the team versus the data that is the product of that and is potentially shareable with a wider group. So I think that's one important distinction that comes from LIGO. And similarly, I think in 2016, we funded a set of small awards, one of which a couple of them looked very specifically at how you instrument the lab. In that case, it was coming out of cognitive neuroscience. Randall Bryant, I think at Johns Hopkins, was one of the key people in this discussion. So we're beginning to fund some research because at that point it is still fundamental research. It is still having to do with research about the infrastructure of science. So yes, it's a very important topic, and thank you for championing it, and we will look for born sharing as a track in future conferences.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ben.
Ben Rogers, University of Iowa. So, Amy, I very much appreciate you calling out software as being a type of data. And so we haven't really heard from others on the panel about that. And I'm curious, particularly from NIH, because we have a large academic medical center and I'm involved in many of those projects. Are you thinking about software as one of these data products?
Yeah, so I think, definitely code, software, all of those things, we use the term data to sort of as a catch-all, but yeah, that's definitely, the data and whatever other sorts of products go with it to allow you to reproduce the research, definitely significant. And, just sort of anecdotally speaking, from my experience working with the researchers at the NIH, especially among, the younger, the postdocs, there's a real interest in developing the expertise to do coding, to, do all that kind of work. And I thought it was very interesting what Victoria had to say yesterday about, how having everything embedded in code really sort of allows us to document that process a lot more robustly. And I think that we're definitely moving in that direction, at least in my experience in the biomedical world.
Yeah, at NOAA, the software that is sort of the most archived or close to archived tends to be the things, the operational algorithms, used in operational satellite data processing, for example. We are just starting to think about more broadly other kinds of more ad hoc software and to what extent we should keep that, and maybe even not archive derived products, but somehow allow the regeneration of derived products from source data. Yeah.
I've been involved in software discovery and reuse systems for almost 20 years now, and if you take a look at our materials resource registry, fully half of the resources in there are software. So we're very much so thinking about software as data.
So I would get into trouble if I truly said software were data. I prefer to talk about intellectual products, of which software we believe is a first-class citizen, as is the case with data. So in the BioSketch world that you all are familiar with, remember that you can report software as well as data, as well as journal publications, and at least from our perspective, they are of equivalent value.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to go into our break. So we're going to go to the back of the room for this one. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Raphael Isokwehi from Bethune-Cookman University. I'm a professor of biology. I'm based in Florida. I've really enjoyed a lot of the presentations, and the knowledge that has been disseminated is very extensive. My question really comes from a more fundamental level of how do we interact with this knowledge? Are there systems in place to help people at multiple levels, from the undergraduates to graduate level, to be able to learn those policies in a way that they can use it for a longer term? Are this information being deposited in educational repositories that can help with the learning and make sure that we have better students that are being prepared? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
So I mentioned the Big Data to Knowledge initiative at the NIH, and that's sort of divided into 4 areas, and training is one of them. So, a pretty significant, funding investment has already been made in development of training resources for data science specifically. So not necessarily the policy piece, but the best practices piece. There's a training coordination center that was funded, and they developed this Big Data U website that sort of brings together data science training resources. So yeah, it's very much, I think, on the, in the awareness of the NIH that we need to make sure that the next generation of researchers, as well as currently working researchers, are able to access the training that they need to enable them to do this type of work effectively.
At NOAA, there are, some educational activities mostly about the planet, right? Like, what are the tides and what is the ocean and so forth, not so much how to use our data. Maybe we should have more of that. I would like to get to a point where as little training is needed and it's just sort of natural and easy, and at least in the geospatial data side, the Earth data side, we have sort of a data fabric where you can just say, hey, for this location and this time, let me know everything that's ever been measured or forecast, and and it's just kind of all there for you. You don't have to assemble it manually, so we're not there yet, but someday.
And I would recommend, if you're not familiar, looking up Software Carpentry and Data Carpentry. They're a nonprofit organization that provides training, seminars, and so forth. Also, CODATA, the International Data Organization, sponsors data science workshops for students, young career researchers. Those are 2 opportunities for training.
I would be remiss if I didn't point out that both software carpentry and data carpentry are funded by the NSF. Yes, also funded by NSF.
Yes. So Amy gets the last word now. And we're gonna wrap up for the break right after Amy's comments.
Including this meeting. So I think the gap that you point to is a very deep and challenging one, and thank you for bringing it up. We all live in our bubbles, and we all talk to each other perhaps entirely too much or sometimes not enough, and we forget how hard it is to bring new members into the community, and I think that's part of what you're addressing. So certainly I agree with my colleagues that the long-term goal is to make the management of the data, whether in flight or at rest, simply intrinsic to the way you properly do science. Many of you know I'm a recovering archaeologist, and there were ways you treated the data. I mean, it never occurred to you that you weren't going to manage the data, you weren't going to weigh it, number it, put accession numbers on it. It was simply the way you did archaeology. And we're looking to move that into this, frankly, more complex world of software and digital data and so on. So how we do that is a work in progress. And sadly, it will vary by agency because our missions are different. So in the case of NSF, one thing I look at when I look at a program called Research Experiences for Undergraduates, which is a way to append additional funding to an existing award to bring students into the culture at an early age, is, what do we tell them about data? So when they're sitting there learning how to run an electron microscope or learning how to do whatever it is they're doing in this very important research project, are they also standing at the bench or standing at the computer learning a little something about the value of managing data?
Well, please join me in thanking again our panelists. A great discussion. I think now we're going into a less than 15-minute break, so yeah. At 10:30, let's reconvene. so much. I'm sorry that I cut you off. But it was great, yeah, it was really. Otherwise, you're,
Not as good
no, but
here.
it's valuable because people are going to the slides. And so we really appreciate that.
So the one about what was the, one of the slides.